Real estate investment practice problem using OneNote. Closing costs rolled into the loan. Get ready because we're raising the stakes with real estate. Here we are in our Excel worksheet. If you have access to the Excel worksheet, would like to follow along, we have 3 tabs on down below: example, practice, and blank tab. Let's take a look at them now, starting with the example tab, in essence being an answer key. We're going to be focusing in on the closing costs, those upfront costs, and thinking about whether or not we can add them or roll them into the loan amount, increasing the loan amount by the closing costs, then paying them over the life of the loan, as well as with interest on them, which could be a scenario if you're kind of tight on cash up front. Now, note this might be something more likely to be seen in a refinance type of situation, although you could see it in a purchase situation depending on your circumstances, although the structure of it could look a little bit funny. So let me just go through that really quickly here. You might be in a situation, and if you're in a purchasing situation where you're saying you're tight on cash, you would like the seller possibly to pick up the closing costs in that case. But the seller, if it's a seller's market, would be likely not wanting to pick up the closing costs. You might be less marketable or less likely to close the deal in that case. So you could try to structure it in such a way which you want to roll them into the loan. But in so doing so, you might say, hey, first let's come up to the agreement and agree on the price at, say, $275,000. And once you agree on that price, then you might say, okay, and now I would like to increase that price by the cost of the closing, increasing it to $286, and also have you pick up then the closing costs on the seller side. In that instance, the seller wouldn't really be picking up the closing costs because you basically increased the agreed upon amount by the closing costs. And so then when they pick them up, it'll basically be rolled in to the loan. And then in essence, you'd be paying them over the life of the loan. So the structure, you can look into the structure of it. We'll just think about it here conceptually in terms of what would happen in that event. Would that be a good, beneficial thing? Obviously, it would be something that would be beneficial to somebody if there's a cash flow situation up front and they're trying to close things with as little cash basically up front possibly as possible, which is often a scenario. So we're saying here scenario, we got the $275,000 loan, 30-year, 360 months. We got the 4.5 on the rate we're going to be saying here. And then we've got the closing costs. Now, if you have the closing costs and you're comparing 2 loans, like you could try to compare 2 loans without basically looking at the closing costs, assuming that both loans are going to have similar closing costs, and then compare the rates and the closing costs. Or you can try to roll those closing costs into an effective rate, or kind of like the APR type of rate, to help you to do those comparisons as well. So we'll think about the rolling that closing cost into the effective rate, since our next scenario would be the idea of seeing if we can get somehow those closing costs into the loan amount, increase in the loan amount, which then pays off the closing costs. So now the loan amount would be at the 286, increasing the amount of the loan, but we only got 275 really that we got to use to pay off the seller, and then the 11,000 in essence was used to pay off, you can imagine in essence, the closing costs of the 11,000. So let's look at that type of scenario. The second tab over here is going to be pre-formatted cells, so you can work through the practice problem without doing so much formatting. And then the third tab is where we're going to work. We're going to work the blank tab and add new things as we go. So we got the data, the 275. We don't have anything down just so we can concentrate on the loan amount at the 275. 30-year loan, 360 months then, 30 times 12, 4.5 at the rate. And then let's think about our closing costs here and say the closing costs, let's just say, are 11,000. 11,000 on the, or let's calculate it this way. Let's say we got the 275 times 0.04. Now you could use some conventional types of percents to try to estimate what the closing costs will be, which will be dependent oftentimes on your location, so you can get some ideas of what you expect the closing costs to be. Oftentimes they're represented or estimated as the percent, say, of the loan amount. So now we're going to say, okay, if I got those closing costs, then my rate is 4.5 on the loan. If I try to roll those closing costs in to the loan to get 1%, that would represent the interest and so on, as well as the closing costs, so I can compare them to other loans, which I can also roll in the closing costs. This is similar to an APR type of calculation we'll call the effective rate. This is going to be equal to the rate formula. It's going to be the number of periods, which is 360, comma, the payment is going to be down here, the 139338, and that needs to be a negative to make this thing work. So we'll put a negative because we want it to work. We want to make that thing work. Present value, I'm going to pick up the loan amount, which is the $275,000. That's how much money we can imagine ourselves getting. We got $275,000 and then paying it, to the seller for the home, right? So obviously we don't actually get the money and pay it, but that's how you can think about it. Minus the closing costs, which we had to pay over and above at that point in time. And so the cash flow going out of the $11,000 and enter, that would be the monthly rate. Let's double click on it again and multiply it times 12. For the yearly rate, we got 4.852. So obviously that would be higher than the rate because we rolled in the closing costs for it. So now let's copy this over. I'm going to copy this whole thing. That's our starting point. Copying from A to I. A to I, Control C, putting that in column K, and saying Control V, pasting it down. So now let's have a scenario where we're going to add the closing cost into the loan. Before we do, though, let's double check our information. Anything with an absolute reference, we need to reformat. So there's an absolute reference on the payment. I don't want it going to column B. I want it to go to that payment right there in column L, L17, F4 on the keyboard, $ before the L and the 17, so I can copy it on down and put our cursor back on it, double click on that fill handle, copying it down. Interest also has an absolute reference in it on B15. We don't want column B. We want this cell right here, the 4.5. Going to select F4 on the keyboard, $ before the L and the 15. Going to copy that on down. And then oftentimes I will change something, let's say the rate to let's say 3%, and just double check that the amortization table looks like it's doing what it should, going down to the bottom of it, seeing if it goes down to 0 by the end. Looks like it does. So it looks like it's doing what we would expect it to, at least at a glance here. We'll put that back to the 4.5. 4.5. And now we're going to say, okay, we got that 11,000 closing costs. What I'm going to try to do now is add that to the loan. So I'm going to add a column up top and try to add this into the loan. So I'm going to select these cells. I'm going to try to put something above it. I'm going to right click on it and insert, and then shift these cells down, shift down. And then I'm going to add the closing costs, and I'm just going to call it closing costs rolled in. And that's going to be equal to the 11,000. So now my loan amount down here would be equal to the 275 minus any down payments plus the closing costs. So now my loan, hold on a second. There's a circle reference there. Let's just type in the 11,000. 11,000. There we have it. So then the end result is going to be the 286. That's the 275 plus the 11,000. So now our loan is going to be at the 286, our starting point, rather than the 275. That means that we're not paying that 11,000 up front if we can get that set up to be set up in that way. However, we are going to end up paying interest on it as well. So the interest, you can see our calculations down below. The payment is now larger, 1,449 versus the 1,393, and the total payments were 501,618 versus 521,618. Interest is going to be at the 235 versus the 226. So obviously over the life of this thing, you're going to be paying more because the loan amount is higher. You're going to be paying interest on it, but the benefit would be that you got that cash flow up front, and that would be the idea. Now, the other option you can compare this to is if you got that lender credit. Remember, the lender credit is a situation where you change it in exchange for the interest rate going up, and you could do some comparing and contrasting if you want to structure between those two using your IRR calculations and see what would be the best on those options if those were options that you were considering as well. So in any case, now we're going to take a look at our effective rate. Now the effective rate, same calculation here. See, now you've got the number of periods. We've got the payment amount is going to be down here now, and then we've got the present value, which means in the present value, we've got the loan amount of the 286, which now includes that 11,000, but we are still in essence paying the closing costs of the 11,000. So in other words, it gets a little confusing, right? Because we've got 286, which you can imagine, like if we took out a loan, they gave us $286,000, but we only got to spend $275,000 to buy what we wanted, the home, and then we had to pay back basically to the lender in essence, or the closing company, right? The 11,000. So that went out as well, but just as part of the closing costs. So really, we could think about, we got the 286 minus the 11,000 at that point in time, which is the 275,000. I'm going to change these closing costs back to 11,000 here. So 11,000 on the closing. So that gives us an effective rate of the 4.838 compared to the effective rate of the 4.852. So they're pretty close because you're kind of in a similar type of situation because you got the same rate up top and you're dealing with those closing costs. But now here you've got the higher loan amount and the closing costs are going to be, a little bit less in comparison to that loan amount. But of course, you're going to be paying more interest and more overall because you have the higher loan amount that you're going to be paying, and you're going to be paying interest in essence on the closing costs. So when you compare the payments, your payments then would be higher, and your total payments would be higher, and your interest would be higher over the life of the loan. You have the similar kind of structure here. Then you got the benefit of basically cash flow up front in that case, meaning you got the 11,000 in essence to pay off the closing costs up front. You got that extra benefit up front. And then over time, you're going to be paying that off with regards to interest. Whereas over here, you paid it basically, up front. So then those two things in terms of timing, the question would be, well, when would those two things kind of cancel each other out? Obviously, in practice, one of your major concerns might simply be to have the cash flow in order to close things out. That's why you're doing it. And then the question would be, well, is the cost worth the benefit of that to get things done? Okay, so we could see here, we could just double check that if we scroll on down and say, well, does this add up to 0 at the bottom? We're going to say it adds up to 0 down there. Okay, let's take a look at what we would consider then like our break-even kind of analysis. First, let's just consider our cash flow on an IRR and just to rethink what that cash flow means in terms of this effective rate. So let's recalculate that. Let's say this is not rolled in versus rolled in. This is going to be the cash flow. Let's make this black and white. Home tab, making this bucket black and white. Then we'll wrap the text and center it. I'm going to make this 0, 1, 2, bringing that all the way down to 360 payments, pulling this on down to 360, pulling it all the way down here to 360 payments, centering it. And then the key point is that first starting point, right? The first starting point on the loan, on the first loan, we got 275, but then we had to pay the 11,000 up front. So we're rolling those closing costs that went out in period 0 up front. And that needs to be moved up to period 0 here. I'm just going to drag that up to period 0. And then we had our payments, which are going to be the 1393 about. And if we copy that on down, copying that on down, and scrolling on down, in essence, we got a total cash flow, then equal to the sum of this whole thing. And that comes out to the 237,618 out, net outflow. And again, just remember this 264, obviously that means that we got money from the bank of the 275. We could assume we got the money, right? And then we had to pay back the bank, then we had to pay that money to the seller. So we got that money, and then we had to pay on top of that the 11,000 in order to get, the 275. That's why we got that net inflow. And then if I add that up, let's do the IRR. The IRR, the equals the IRR, summing up this entire thing, or this range of cells, times 12. So it looks like this formula. There's the formula. Let's make that into a percent, add some decimals. There's the 4.852. That 4.852 then is the same as this effective rate that we calculated over here. Again, it gets a little funny over time though, because now we rolled in those front costs, those front-loaded costs up front, so we can have a different IRR throughout the term of the loan. Let's do the same thing. I'm going to copy these cells and do the same thing for the second loan. So this is going to be the one where it is rolled in. Let's say is rolled in. And then the front point, the starting point we got this time, we got a loan of $286,000, which includes the closing costs, but in essence, we still had to pay out basically the closing costs of the $11,000. Now again, that could be structured kind of funny if it was a purchasing process, because it might look logistically like they were paid by the seller. But remember, the scenario would be, we agreed on $275, and then I increased specifically to cover the closing costs to $286, so if you're really thinking about it, you basically kind of paid the closing costs in the increase of the sales price if you were able to structure it, if that's something you had to do to structure it that way. So really, you got $286 because you're paying off, in essence, the closing costs, right? So we're going to say that means that we got $275 in total. So we got $286 of the loan, and then we had to pay $11 back in order to get the loan, in essence, is the way and then the $275 is what we actually got to use to purchase the home in that case. Okay, so if we then were to take our payments are going to be equal to the $1,449, and let's copy those down and scroll all down to the bottom and do our totals. This equals the sum of this entire thing. So there we have it. And so we could see like the difference between these net flows that we had, 9,065, and this equals the IRR. This equals the IRR of this whole thing. And we're going to take that and close it up and multiply it times 12. So the formula looks like that. The IRR of that range times 12. Let's make that a percent, add some decimals. There's the 4.838. The 4.838, pretty close, but not exactly the same between the two, even though the actual payment amounts will be different and so on, because we have the larger loan on the one side. So there's the 4.838. Okay, so now let's think about our break even between these two scenarios and say, okay, where's it going to break even? We're going to say, all right, well, let's say this is going to be the break even point, because we have this timing difference that happened with that 11,000 up front versus not up front. So let's say we got the upfront cost, upfront closing costs. If we paid them up front, we'd have the 11,000 that we paid. Let's bring it, say, equals the 11,000 on the closing. Let's format this black and white, font group black and white. And so that's our upfront cost, and then we got the difference in payments. The difference in payments then is going to be, let's put a colon there, it's going to be the payments rolled in. Let's say payments rolled in, meaning payments with the closing costs rolled in, that's what I'm trying to say, is going to be the higher payment. So we rolled in, we got the higher loan resulting in the higher payment, and then we're going to compare that to the payments not rolled in, which is going to be equal to the payments, lower payments, if we paid the closing costs up front. There we go. We're going to underline that. And then we got the difference between the two. That's going to be the difference. So the difference between the two then equaling about, because we took off the pennies, 1,449 minus 1,393, 56 about. There's some pennies involved there. We can add the pennies if we want. So there we go. So then we've got the break-even point. Break-even point in months would be equal to the 11,000 closing cost divided by that difference in payments. So from a cash flow standpoint, 197, fairly significant out there. And then the break-even in years would be equal to the 197 divided by 12, 16, adding a couple decimals, there we go, underlined here. So that's when you think the two scenarios would break even. But again, the reason you're putting it down up front is probably because you felt you needed to get everything, to get the cash flow to make everything happen. So then let's try to work that out with our IRR calculation and say, well, does that make sense from an IRR perspective? Let's try that. And so let's copy these. Let's copy this one and copy that and say IRR is going to be equal to this, and these are equal to that. Not negative, but that. And then I'm going to copy that down, and we're just going to stop it now at 16 or 197. So at 197 down here, scrolling down to 197, right there, we'll delete everything underneath that and say that's going to be our starting point. Now, if this was the end, we'd have to pay off the ending balance if we stopped it at this point. So we could say, okay, well, what would the ending balance be then? If we take, I'm going to say this is negative, scrolling all the way over here. So we'd have this ending balance that we'd have to pay off and minus the payment of the 1393. So there we have it. And then we can total that up. Say total. That's not how you spell it. That's not how it's spelled. And then we'll total the sum of these. Summing that up. And then we can take the IRR, which is going to be equal to the IRR of these. Taking the IRR times 12. So it looks like that. There's the formula. Let's make that then a percent, add some decimals. So we're at the 4.941. Now this one is actually a little bit confusing because we're trying to find the place where the two are the same, even though like both of them had these changes in their timing. So we're not going to be able to hold one constant, meaning this one I changed, the effective rate is different than the rate here, meaning there's going to be a timing difference throughout the loan. The same thing happened here. The effective rate is different than this rate. So we're looking for the point in time where the two rates are basically the same, even though they don't, but they're fairly close. So they're going to be, fairly close throughout the whole time, most likely. So I'm going to delete this added column. And let's do one more. We're going to copy these. Put that over here. And this is going to be is rolled in. This will equal the 175 now. And this will equal the 1449. Copying it down. And then we'll scroll down and check it out at the end here, which is closed out right there. That looks good. So now I need the ending balance. The ending balance at the 197 for this one is going to be the 176,486 minus the payment 1449. There we have it. Let's total this one up, equals the sum of this whole thing. And so there we have that. And the IRR equals the IRR is going to be this column. Close it up times 12. Formula looking like that. Let's make that a percent, adding a couple decimals. We're at the 4.898. So it's fairly close still right there with the IRR. Notice you still have a significant difference in the cash flow, which is the 6,968, and that's due to differences in the ending balances here. And the reason you could still have an internal rate of return that is still fairly different in terms of cash flow. Notice that you could calculate this on a cash flow basis, but the time value of money would mean that up front here you have this difference in the upfront cash flow. And so because there's a time value of money involved in it, meaning paying cash up front is worth more, the cash up front is worth more than cash 16 years later. So you've got that difference in terms of the time value of money that's kind of worked into the IRR. So it's not exactly like a cash flow. You could think about it from a cash flow standpoint, which even this still isn't quite exact, you'll see, because of that ending balance problem. But you could think about it just from a cash flow standpoint, and then you typically want to think about it with regards to a time value of money standpoint, because again, if you're talking about an upfront payment, which is significantly different than a payment over a long period of time, then you've got time value of money situation. Like the $11,000 upfront is worth a lot more than $11,000 if it were to be paid 16 years later, and so on. So in any case, let's do our formatting here. Let's make this blue and bordered. We'll select this item and say, let's do the blue and border blue, and then we'll border blue this one, border blue on this one, border blue, and then let's do some underlining down here. Do an underline there and there, underline, make this border blue, and then these ones over here just for formatting sake, for the sake of formatting. For formatting's sake, we're going to say border blue, and then we'll say this one, we'll do this for formatting's sake. We have to do it. Border blue. And so then I'm going to copy this down, and we could do an underline here possibly, and an underline there. So there you've got that kind of scenario, and then you might want to compare, you might have a situation where you're able to compare something like this to, say, a lender credit, where they try to bump up the rate, which again, you'd want to be looking in essence at the APR between those two scenarios and do a similar kind of comparison in that way.